You know that story you learned in school? The one about the Boston Tea Party where angry American colonists protested super high taxes on tea by dumping it into the harbor? Well, what if I told you that the most important part of that story, the part about the high taxes, is almost completely wrong? Today, we're going to dig into the real story, and you'll see why this famous protest was never really about the tea at all.
Okay, so picture this. It's the night of December 16th, 1773. It is freezing cold in Boston Harbor. A whole group of men, some of them disguised as Mohawk warriors, quietly board 3 British ships. And for the next 3 hours, they just go to work, systematically smashing open hundreds of huge, heavy wooden chests and throwing all that tea into the icy water. It was this wild, incredibly bold act of protest. But to really get it, we have to ask a really weird question.
You heard that right. The Tea Act of 1773 actually lowered the price of legal British tea. It made it even cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that most of the colonists were already drinking. So why in the world would you destroy something that was just made cheaper for you? That paradox, that single question, is the absolute key to understanding the entire American Revolution. All right, so this whole event, led by a group of patriots you've probably heard of called the Sons of Liberty, well, it wasn't just some random riot. Nope, this was a very carefully planned political statement. And to understand it, we've got to look at what was actually going on.
So what was the real price of this tea? Because this conflict definitely didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was basically the result of 2 massive problems crashing into each other. A huge financial crisis at one of the world's biggest companies, and a major constitutional crisis over who really had the right to govern the American colonies.
So it all came down to 2 completely opposite sets of goals. On one side, you had the British government trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. First, save the East India Company, which was on the brink of bankruptcy, by giving it a monopoly on tea. And second, finally force the colonists to accept that Parliament had the right to tax them. But on the other side, the colonists saw this as a massive attack on their most basic principles, the idea of no taxation without representation and a deep fear of a government-backed monopoly that could crush local businesses.
And that phrase, no taxation without representation, it became the rallying cry for a generation. For the colonists, this wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was a fundamental right they believed they had as Englishmen. The logic was simple. Since they didn't get to elect anyone to the British Parliament, any tax that Parliament tried to slap on them was, by definition, an act of tyranny. It was a violation of the British Constitution itself.
Now, this whole standoff didn't happen overnight. It was building for years. Back in 1767, the Townshend Acts taxed all sorts of goods, including tea. The colonists boycotted, and by 1770, most of those taxes were repealed. But, and this is the absolute crucial point, Parliament left the tax on tea. They didn't do it for the money, they did it to prove that they could. So the Tea Act of 1773 wasn't a new tax, it was this really sneaky plan to get the colonists to finally pay the old one. So here's the trap. The British government thought they were being brilliant. They figured, hey, if we make the tea so cheap, the colonists won't be able to resist. They'll buy the tea, pay the tiny tax, and by doing that, they'll finally accept that Parliament can tax them. But they totally misread the room. For the colonists, getting cheap tea at the expense of their political freedom, that was no bargain. It was a Trojan horse. Which brings us right back to Boston Harbor. When those ships loaded with this, let's call it principled tea, sailed into American ports, it wasn't just a delivery. It was a constitutional showdown waiting to happen. And in Boston, that showdown was about to become explosive. You could just feel the tension ratcheting up. The first ship, the Dartmouth, arrives, and a 20-day clock starts ticking. By law, after 20 days, the cargo had to be unloaded and the tax paid. The colonists demanded the ship be sent back to England, but Governor Thomas Hutchinson absolutely refused. He was determined to enforce British law, and it probably didn't hurt that his own sons stood to make a profit from selling the tea. On the very last day, December 16th, with thousands of people gathered, the governor gave his final answer. No. The time for talking was officially over. So, what was the scale of the response? Well, that night, the Sons of Liberty destroyed 340 chests of tea. And let me be clear, this wasn't some symbolic gesture where they tossed a few boxes overboard. This was the complete and total annihilation of the entire shipment. The financial cost was just staggering. The East India Company reported losses of over 9,600 pounds sterling. To put that in perspective, in today's money, we're talking about roughly $2.1 million worth of private property, destroyed in just a few hours. And this isn't just an estimate. We've got the East India Company's own manifest, and it tells the whole story.
Across the 3 ships, the Beaver, Dartmouth, and Eleanor, we're talking over 92,000 pounds of tea. This breakdown just shows you how massive and incredibly well organized this whole thing really was.
So what about those famous disguises? They weren't just a convenient way to hide their faces. By dressing as Mohawks, the protesters were making a huge symbolic statement. They were rejecting their identity as British subjects and claiming a new one, an American one. It was their way of saying, we are no longer playing by Britain's rules.
Okay, so you destroy millions of dollars of British property and openly defy the crown. What happens next? Well, this was a direct challenge to the authority of the British Empire, and the empire's response was going to be swift and furious. This one act of protest would directly lead to laws that pushed the colonies right to the brink of war.
When the news finally reached London, pretty much everyone was appalled, even politicians who had been sympathetic to the colonies. Prime Minister Lord North's government saw this not as a protest, but as an open act of rebellion. The feeling in Parliament was clear. If we don't crack down hard, right now, British control in America is finished. Parliament's response was a series of laws so harsh the colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. First, they shut down the port of Boston, completely crippling its economy. Then they basically dissolved the elected government in Massachusetts and put the colony under direct military control. These laws were designed to punish Massachusetts and make an example out of it for everyone else.
But Britain's plan backfired. Royally. Instead of scaring the other colonies into submission, these harsh punishments absolutely horrified them. They all realized, hey, if Parliament can do this to Boston, they can do it to any of us. And the result? It wasn't division. It was unity. For the first time, the colonies came together to form the First Continental Congress and plan a unified resistance.
The echoes of that December night have resonated for centuries. What was then called the destruction of the tea would eventually be renamed, reinterpreted, and become one of the most powerful symbols in all of American history.
Here's a fascinating little detail. For almost 50 years, nobody called it the Boston Tea Party. They just called it what it was, the destruction of the tea. That more playful name only became popular around the 1830s, when a new generation started to romanticize the event, transforming it from a controversial act of vandalism into a heroic, patriotic founding myth.
And this contrast says it all, really. On the left, you've got a notice from 1773, just dripping with raw anger, calling people traitors to their country. And on the right, a postage stamp from 1973 celebrating the bicentennial. You can literally see the journey from a dangerous, divisive protest to a sanitized, celebrated national symbol.
And that symbolism has had incredible staying power. The Boston Tea Party has been held up as an example by protesters all over the world, from Mohandas Gandhi during India's fight for independence to all sorts of modern political movements today. It's become a universal shorthand for standing up to unjust authority. And don't think for a second that this was something people only realize with hindsight. They knew, even then, how big this was. The very next day, a young lawyer named John Adams wrote this in his diary. He understood immediately that this wasn't just some local riot. It was, in his words, an epocha in history, a turning point from which there was no going back.
So when you boil it all down, the Boston Tea Party was never about the price of tea. It was about a fundamental fight over power, principles, and rights. It was the exact moment a political argument, one that had been fought with pamphlets and boycotts, finally boiled over into direct physical action, pushing Britain and its colonies down a path that would lead straight to revolution. And it leaves us with a question that still echoes today. When does a protest become a revolution?